Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Military Aviation Museum for our monthly hangar talk. Two things today are unique. If you come to these, you kind of used to seeing my ugly mug up here with a microphone. Good news is I don't have any announcements. Not a one. So I'm going to turn the mic over to a gentleman that some of you know. You know because he spoke in your museum April of 10 and April of 09. He's a B-25 combat pilot. And I'm trying to get him to come back this coming April. He's here for one reason. He wants to introduce our speaker. They're friends of many decades. With nothing else, I'm going to give it to Lieutenant Colonel Buzz Wagner.
I can't tell you how much a pleasure this is to be able to introduce a good friend and probably one of the unsung test pilots that we have in the Air Force. And I want to tell you things that, because of his modesty, I know he won't. But I want you to know just what a career this gentleman has had. He came into the service in 1939 right out of high school, 1 week out of high school. And ended in 1964 as a full colonel. And that's a pretty good feat in itself. He was an aircraft mechanic first, got into the cadets, and came out as a P-40 pilot, was in the squadron at Bowling Air Force Base that was protecting the Capitol when the war started. He's participated in flying a P-40 with other Army officers off of the SS Ranger into North Africa, delivering P-40s to an organization that had lost all of theirs. And he ended up in A-36s, this little airplane, and flew 80 missions in that. Came home and wangled his way into Wright-Patterson. And they were going to send him in as an instructor on P-40s in Georgia somewhere, and he said, no, I don't want to do that. And so he got them to sign him to Wright-Patterson, and then he worked his way into the fighter test business. He eventually became the chief of fighter tests and also the commandant of the test pilot school. And I'm going to name drop a little bit, but some of the pilots that flew for this gentleman were Chuck Yeager, Bob Hoover, fastest man alive, Frank Edwards, to mention just three of them. And he was known back in those days as Mr. F-86 because he was the first military pilot to fly it. He did all the phase 2 testing on that airplane, approving it for the Air Force. He's flown 147 different airplanes. And I flew 24, and I used to feel good about it until I met him. 147 different airplanes, which included all the German fighters. All the enemy fighters were shipped back for them to test to find out what the vulnerabilities are, so that the guys who were still in combat would know the best way to take care of them. He's flown the Messerschmitt 262. He's flown the American version of it, which was the YP-59. He's not only flown it, he was the first one to put it into the trees when both engines quit on takeoff. He's not satisfied with that. He had a tour with the RAF. He flew 8 or 9 of their airplanes. He came back and he was in the first exchange program with our Navy, checked out on the F-8F Bearcat, and made 50 landings on Atlantic Fleet carriers. So he's been in everything as far as the test flying is concerned. And during the Korean War, he ended up at Far Eastern Air Force headquarters as the fighter requirements man, operational man for all the airplanes that went into Korea. And he was back and forth in Korea all the time. Came back and got into flight management, flight programming, and in the Pentagon building, and he was the program manager on many of the 100 series fighters that the Air Force had. I can't say enough about him. I know he's unassuming, and And we both have something in common, and we both entered in the ranks and worked our way on up. But I have nothing but admiration for this gentleman. I'd like you all to help me welcome Colonel Ken Chilstrom.
Well, you can tell it's good to have a friend introduce you. And Don is one of my best friends. Well, I'm going to tell you my flying history a bit, which really centers on World War II combat to start with. And then the beginning of the jet age in this country started in 1944, and that was in the beginning of the development of the jet aircraft. So the 1940s turned out to be the best part of my flying career. That may seem a little ancient history to some of you people, but I think that I'll try to tell my story somewhat in context of aviation history. And I think really you all recognize that aviation has really had a short history, just over 100 years, since the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, developed the airplane in Dayton, Ohio, and then flew it at Kitty Hawk. But the Wright brothers in 1903 were the first to really fly, a human being to get off the ground and fly. Well, you know, they sold the first airplane in 1908 to the War Department. And then, if you might recall your history, World War I started in 1914. And that was only 6 years after the Army got their first airplane. The U.S. really was slow in getting started into military aviation. The airplane was going to be visualized as something that, at least you got airborne, you can see things from above the ground better than you can see from the ground. And that really is what the purpose of the airplane at the beginning of World War I, 1914 to 1918. I want to mention here that something that I felt was important to realize is that the aircraft that were used in World War I, the people that were the most forward in aviation were the Germans, the French, the English, then the Italians, and then the Soviets. The U.S. was number 6 ranked in aviation in 1918. We had no aircraft that was capable of flying combat in World War I. We had the Jenny, which was known as the J-4, and it was a good airplane for training. And later, after the war, it was used for barnstorming throughout the U.S. Some of the pilots that didn't have a job were able to get an opportunity to take people up for their first flight for 50 cents or a dollar, and barnstorming was really the thing that those pilots did in the early 20s. So aviation got off to somewhat of a slow start, particularly in military aviation. Now, I think there's some people here who will remember when Charles Lindbergh first flew, May in 1927. I was 6 years old. And I can remember when Charles Lindbergh flew from New York non-stop to Paris. And I'll tell you, that's what got me interested in aviation at 6 years. And I think my father bought me the first rubber band powered model airplane, and that's where I started building model airplanes, was during the 30s, during the Depression years. And it's interesting, I think, to realize that how slow aviation really got started. Because nowadays, with all the people flying commercially and on jet aircraft, you expect to go from coast to coast in 3.5, 4 hours. Well, it took a long while to be in the beginning to get things really motivated in this country to accept aviation. But I felt that I wanted to be a pilot when I was just a teenager. And building model airplanes is a good way to understand a lot of things about airplanes, how they're controlled, what's critical in getting an airplane into the air safely and back down on the ground. So building model airplanes was my hobby, and I'm sure glad I had that opportunity. I had a couple good buddies at that time in high school that were interested in the same thing. They wanted to build model airplanes because they visualized and they thought they wanted to learn to fly too. Well, we graduated in 1939 from high school in the suburb of Chicago. And obviously, the Depression years was tough on our parents to be able to send anybody off to college. And I know my parents couldn't afford to do that, neither could my friends. So we decided on our own, not our parents encouraging. We went down to Chanute Field, Rantoul, Illinois, and at that time, we found out that to get into the flying cadet program and be a pilot, you had to have 2 years of college. Well, that was a little disheartening, obviously, at that point to find out that we weren't qualified, but we thought we're going to find our way. There's a way, where there's a will, there's a way. And so we signed up, we enlisted in the Army Air Corps on June 15, 1939. And I'm always wondering now when I look back, it wasn't my parents encouraging me to go join the Army at all. But I think I did the right thing, because that gave me the beginning of my career in aviation. And being trained as a mechanic to start with is actually good training for a pilot, as you might appreciate. You know a little bit more about what's going underneath the hood if you go through and learn what the engine is all about and many other parts of the airplane. So I feel getting the start as a mechanic was a real advantage in my flying career later. And lo and behold, it took about a year and a half to get tutored and go to night school in order to pass the exam. Well, it was advantageous to get commissioned in those days because you're then commissioned as a second lieutenant, and although they did train some pilots that were giving them a sergeant rank or flight officer. Chuck Yeager, Bob Hoover, who later had wonderful careers in the Air Force, they started out as flying sergeants. They didn't have the education to go into the cadet program right away. So that's the beginning for a lot of us that wanted to fly, but we had to find a way of getting there. Well, I'll tell you, I enjoyed flight training and went through the conventional primary, basic, and advanced. Some of you may have heard of that. And anyway, it took about 9 months, and we accumulated maybe a couple hundred hours of flying. My first assignment then in October of '42 was to Bowling Field, Washington, D.C. to fly P-40s, supposedly to guard the Capitol, although there wasn't much threat from the Germans being able to fly over the ocean at that time. They didn't have long-range strategic bombers like we developed. So my first flying was in P-40s, and lo and behold, we weren't in Washington too long when they decided that they needed P-40s over in the desert campaign when the U.S. started in World War II. And so we went to the factory at Buffalo, brought brand new P-40s, took them down airplane right up here at Norfolk. And we loaded the 75, 3 squadrons of aircraft onto the USS Ranger. There's an old, one of the early aircraft carriers. And of course, none of us were qualified as to be Navy or carrier pilots. We didn't need to be. We were one-way Corrigans taking off about 100 miles from Casablanca. The Navy, I don't think, really appreciated providing ferry service for a bunch of Army people flying P-40s. But they launched us about 100 miles from Casablanca, and they got that old carrier up to max speed in order to get the most wind over the deck. And I was in the middle of the 75, so I was about number 36, I think, taking off. And interestingly enough, there is a P-40 down here on the flight line. A P-40 built by Curtiss in Buffalo, New York. It was a good airplane. It was used over in the Shanghai Shek days in China. And the P-40 was a really rugged airplane. Well, we all got off this carrier one way or another, although I didn't look ahead. I never saw anybody fly off the deck. The torque on a propeller-driven airplane with that amount of power, over 1,000 horsepower, you would drift to the left. And every one of the guys that I saw ahead of me all went off the side of the carrier in the front and down, and I wondered whether they made it or what happened to them. And then ground effect took over, and they had enough lift effect from getting closer to the water. And we all, 75 of us that took off that day, made it to Casablanca. Well, when we got to Casablanca, we hadn't known that what was going to happen to us. Really, the people up in Tunisia, you've all heard maybe the Desert Fox, Rommel. The German army and the British were fighting the Germans in the desert then. They lost all their airplanes on the ground. The German tanks obviously came in easily and destroyed the aircraft. It was easier to destroy them on the ground than in the air. So they took all of our P-40s, and so now you had 75 pilots that didn't know what they were going to do. But we were lucky. It wasn't long, in a month or two, that they had already planned to ship over 3 squadrons of the early model of the P-51. This is called an A-36. It actually is one of the earliest models of the P-51, which became one of our primary fighters in World War II. And I flew 80 missions in the A-36. Well, really, it was a better airplane than the P-40. So I really came out, I think, ahead by what happened to us was actually a bonus. We all enjoyed flying this airplane. It was a fighter bomber. It had 6 forward-firing machine guns. The difference between this and a P-51 really is that it had dive brakes up on the wings that came out and also on the bottom, so that when we would use this airplane as a fighter bomber, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Well, anyway, now we're over in North Africa, and we're getting introduced to a new airplane. So they sent us to Fez, F-E-Z, North Africa, where we were going to get acquainted with the airplane, learn how to use it, and then go up to Tunisia, Cape Bon Peninsula. And it was a great experience, of course. When you're 21 years old, everything is a great experience. And I think that flying across North Africa, we didn't have much more than maps that were really produced by the French. And you draw, in order to navigate, you draw a line on the map from A to B, and somehow or other we would find our way. There weren't many railroads over there to follow in North Africa. But we all then went on up to Cape Bon Peninsula, and the Germans had abandoned their campaign in that part of the world. They were running out of fuel, and Hitler and the German General Staff decided that it really wasn't necessary to stay in that part of the world, and so they abandoned it. And it took a while, of course, to get them up through the toe of Italy. Well, we were involved as a fighter outfit, dive bombing and strafing targets in Sicily and Italy. And we were involved with most of our missions. We were assigned to dive bomb the 2 500-pound bombs. This airplane was capable of carrying, as it shows right here, 2 500-pound bombs. And what we would do is go over about 10,000 to 12,000 feet. the main difference between the early 51s is the engine. It had an Allison engine made in the U.S., whereas the later P-51s all had a Rolls-Royce Merlin made by Packard. And most of the P-51s that were built, there were almost 15,000, had the better engine, the Merlin engine. But we flew, this was all right for the mission that we had, flying at 10, 12,000 feet. We'd find the target and then open the dive brakes and roll in. And the more vertical we were, the more accurate our bombing would be. So we had nothing but a ring and bead sight, so we had to try to get absolutely vertical. And then after we saw that we were on target, we dropped the bombs and then tried to find an escape route from that area where obviously the targets were, because the Germans did have a good flash. Anyway, that was a typical, then after dropping the bombs, our mission was to straight. We'd get down to treetop level and we would shoot anything that moved. It would be trucks, motorcycles, whatever. And really, strafing, you heard the story that my friend Don Wagner in flying the B-25, strafing is a very effective weapon with 50 caliber machine guns. They had 12 and 18 of them, but we had 6 on this fighter, and really that would completely cover the back end of the truck from the range that we would have. So using the airplane as a strafing airplane, I think, was the most effective use. And we were involved in the invasion of Sicily, which only lasted a short while. General George Patton was the U.S. commander, by the way, and our outfit generally followed Patton's army. And our targets were generally, I think, came from their knowledge of what was happening in the planning that they had to face for the future of getting the Germans out of Sicily and also then out of Italy. So I think it was June or July of 43 that we supported the army in the invasion in Salerno beachhead of Italy. And interestingly enough, I think that to really learn, the Italians, everybody knew we were coming, including the Germans. And so the invasion, they were waiting for this unloading of troops on the beachhead, and also the support that we gave them from the air. In fact, as soon as they cleared enough land for us to develop an airstrip, we were the first airstrip on the Salerno beachhead. And after a couple days, we were told by the Army that they weren't sure the Germans were better dug in than they had anticipated. And so they thought they might be driving us off the beachhead. So they told us, you have a choice. You can either join the Army, leave your airplane, or you can get your airplane and fly back to Sicily. Well, you know what our choice would be. There was no doubt we were going to put our best mechanic in the seat, and we'd sit on his lap, and we'd fly back to Sicily, where we would find another opportunity. So things didn't go too well in the beginning of the invasion of Italy, but that's where I flew finally up to 80 missions, and I don't want to spend too much time really on that part because it's not the most interesting part to me as far as my flying career. But to give you an example, on strafing, I was leading a flight of 8 aircraft somewhere south of Rome on a coastal highway. And the Germans had a very effective weapon that they used against us, and that they mounted 20mm cannons in quads, and these were on trucks or whatever. And what they would do, and if they knew we were coming, they'd wait until they literally saw you, and then they didn't aim at the airplane, they just sprayed the air and made us fly through it. Well, actually, it was interesting. Many times they couldn't really, is it too loud? So what would happen is that the way to, obviously for the Germans, which they wanted to know when we were coming, and they couldn't see us until we actually appeared when we were flying at treetop level. What happened is they'd fire a burst of colored flak at maybe 10,000 feet. They didn't have radar in those days to alert everybody. What they would do then is they'd fire this burst of flak, and then the people down the valley were alerted to know that somebody's coming. And so generally we weren't a surprise always. They were waiting for us to fly, and they would just spray the air with this 20-millimeter cannon. Well, on one of the latter missions, I think I might have had about 60 or 70 missions at that time. What happened is I was the flight leader with 8. I came home with 2 besides myself. I lost 5 guys in that one fighter suite strafing. And out of that, when you fly that low above the treetops, you don't see everything that's happening, of course, to somebody that's having trouble. So if an airplane went in, you might see a puff of black smoke and whatever. And but we found out of the 5 missing, 2 of them crashed, but 3 of them pulled up and bailed out and eventually became prisoners of war. So that was, we had somewhat severe losses doing the job. We thought we were doing a very important one and very effective. So strafing, which is still something that is being done in any military operation. So anyway, that was my experience of flying combat, and my tent mate had 87 missions, I had 80, and we were asked that we wanted, because of morale of the outfit, nobody had ever gone home and rotated. And you may have heard that back in the European theater, that bomber pilots were rotating crews about 25 missions, fighter pilots were rotating at 50 missions. So I had flown 80 and my tent mate had 87. The group commander came and said, would you care to be the first ones to rotate back to the U.S.? So they gave us orders. They didn't give us an airline ticket. We had to hitchhike our way back to the U.S. to find our next opportunity, next assignment. Well, here's where I want to mention a few things. Just as a reminder for those of you that didn't live during that time period. This country had a population of about 130 million. It's slightly more than half of what it is today. Today it's over 320 million or whatever. For our country, it was really quite small. And the resources, when the war started in 1940, as I joined it, there were only 20,000 officers and airmen in the Army Air Corps. About a little over 1,000 of those 20,000 were pilots, or capable of flying. The rest were support people, mechanics, etc. So this country had a lot to do. It's unbelievable, it is in my mind, what happened in the next 5 years. This country really, and it all happened, of course, faster once Pearl Harbor, Japan awakened a sleeping giant. Because I'll tell you, even though President Roosevelt knew what was going on, Congress was actually reluctant to even turn over and support the British. The British were pleading with us for help with destroyers and against submarines, etc. So this country was getting off to a very slow start in 1940, and we had eventually 16 million men and women in uniform. 2.5 million were in the Army Air Corps. They've grown, and within 5 years, we had grown from 20,000 to 2.5. They all had to be trained as armament people, mechanics, all kinds of training that had to be done, and it's amazing what was done in such a short period of time. So I want to mention here, I think, the fact that when you have 16 million men in uniform, they didn't produce these airplanes that were used. They were produced here at home by the mothers and fathers, uncles and aunts, grandparents. They went to work in the factories on the home front, mind you, of this country. They produced trucks, all the ammunition, besides the food that was needed, all the armament, airplanes, ships, etc. And one of the stories that I'll never forget, I guess, is that back when Winston Churchill came over and visited President Roosevelt in 1940, he said, "I think we're going to need 50,000 airplanes." Well, Roosevelt called in all the industry heads of the Boeing Company and Republic Aircraft, North American. Well, they, in the year in 1939 and 40, they had produced somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 airplanes. All of the companies in 1 year. Now they wanted 50,000 airplanes. Well, again, this is a tribute to what our home front, the people that were our fathers and mothers, they went to work and didn't complain, and they worked 50, 60-hour weeks with gas rationing, meat rationing, the whole works. And they're the ones that produced the airplanes that I got to fly. So this is something that is not maybe often mentioned or appreciated, but the home front really are as much the winner of the war, World War II, as the men that fought it. So anyway, how lucky I was when I got back to the States after flying my 80 missions. Well, I heard about Wright Field. I didn't really know much about what they did at Wright Field, but I wanted to get into something like I thought of as flight testing, and I wanted to fly other aircraft. And lo and behold, I couldn't have picked a better place or better time to get into the best flying that any pilot could ever dreamed of. We had all these airplanes. The industry was turned loose by finally the Congress realized that they had to support the war, and they turned the industry loose to where they could come up with their own idea of what new aircraft might look like or be designed. And it wasn't an order blank coming from the Army Air Corps that produced a lot of the airplanes. And so eventually, in production, it didn't take too long. We found out which ones really are the better airplanes to produce in numbers. You may have all heard of Richard Bong, who flew the P-38 in the South Pacific. Well, he loved that airplane, and it was a good airplane. It cost about $120,000 to build a P-38 in those days in large numbers. And they produced about 10, 12,000 of the P-38s. The long production of the P-51 that we see right out here on the flight line, it produced 15,000 P-51. I flew every model of the P-51, from the A, the A-36, to the A, the B, the C, the D models, up through F and H. So I have a couple thousand hours of flying the P-51. It's one of the best airplanes of World War II. And production costs, it's interesting, I think, because everything costs too much today. A P-51 could be built for just over $50,000. And when it came out the factory, it was really a beautiful piece of machinery. So, P-47, we produced, I think, 13,000 P-47s on Long Island, Republic Aircraft. Besides the aircraft that I got to fly, the Navy, of course, Grumman aircraft, they were turning out fighters for, the Navy was primarily the fighting air force in the Pacific. They had, of course, had to build carriers and everything that go with it to support. So the Navy had several contractors. The Corsair, this airplane sitting over here in the corner, was a great fighter bomber that the Marines used in the Pacific against the Japanese islands, Guadalcanal, etc. I flew the Corsair, and it's a wonderful airplane. It has the same engine that the good old P-47 have, the R-2800. Back in those days, of course, nowadays you're all jet-oriented. You know, nobody thinks about airplanes with propellers anymore, other than the small light aircraft. But I'll tell you, of course, that engine built by Pratt & Whitney, and I have a soft spot in my heart for Pratt & Whitney because I worked for them my last years before retirement. I flew their engines, and then later I got to work with the company that builds it. And Pratt & Whitney United Technologies did a great job on building the R-2800 engine, which went from 1,500 to 2,000 horsepower over a period of time. That was one of the best engines, really, of the war. There was another good manufacturer, the Wright Aeronautical. They built good engines too. But the Packard Merlin Rolls-Royce that was in the P-51 was another one of the very best engines, and was built under license. The British Rolls-Royce people designed the engine, and they furnished it in the Spitfires, and even put it in their 4-engine Lancaster bomber. But the Merlin engine had to be one of the best engines of World War II. And of course, the propeller industry was important. Hamilton Standard, Curtiss Electric. We all had our favorites, and the favorites usually become the engine and the pieces, that part of the airplane that got you back safely. Obviously, that makes nothing more than good sense. You favor something that serves you well. And I'll tell you, we had some wonderful equipment built by people that were conscientious in building some quality goods. Now, compared to the, I'll digress a minute to the Japanese airplanes, which in Wright Field we had a collection of about 10 or 12 different Japanese airplanes, along with the German aircraft I got to fly. Now, the Japanese airplanes in World War II were very lightweight, maneuverable, etc., but they were flimsy. They weren't built rugged like our aircraft, and they didn't have all the safety features ours with bulletproof armor that we used, which added weight to the airplane. But I took the Zero from Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, to put it on display in 1944 in Washington. So people like to see what was the enemy aircraft like. So we had the airplanes there at Wright Field, so we tried to do what we can to help the cause in selling war bonds, I guess. So I took the Zero to Washington. I took the Focke-Wulf 190 from Dayton, Ohio to Chicago to put it on Lakeshore Drive to get the people interested in buying more war bonds in Chicago. So these were some extra jobs that weren't a part of flight testing, per se, but if we had the airplanes, and this is another one of those interesting things that we got to do. We all enjoy going out and showing these aircraft to the general public. So, at Wright Field in flight testing, we had every fighter built, from the P-35 on up to the XP-75, 77. They're almost, I couldn't tell you all the numbers. They built sometimes just 2 or 3 of a single airplane, and it didn't take too long for us to evaluate and determine whether the airplane really deserved to be, continued in production, or whether or not we already had enough P-51s, P-38s, P-47s. We didn't need others that came close to when we already had a good product. And so the right decisions were made. We enjoyed having the opportunity to fly these airplanes. Like I flew the P-60E model, the C model. It was built by Curtiss Company that built the P-40. But it had the same engine as the P-47, had the same performance. In the meantime, we had production lines turning out quality airplanes so we didn't need the P-60 model at all. We built, Bell Aircraft built the P-39. They have one of those right in the other hangar, I believe. And we built, I think, 4,000 and gave them to the Soviets. The Soviets during World War II were our allies, you may remember. So the 39 was an airplane that had the engine not in the nose, but embedded in the fuselage, and it compromised its load carrying amount of fuel, so it was short on range, and it couldn't carry the load that we could carry on other aircraft. So the Russians used it to some advantage. We gave over 4,000 to them, and so the Bell Aircraft built another little airplane called the XP-77. They thought this was going to help combat the Zero. Well, really it wasn't. It was built more like a midget racer. And I flew, we had 3 of them at Wright Field, and we all enjoyed flying it because it was a hot little airplane, but it really wasn't going to be a good combat airplane. So it didn't take long for that to be canceled out. Another airplane that comes to mind is the XP-75. There was a company, Fisher Body. Some of you old-timers might remember that General Motors used Fisher Body to produce the design and build the bodies of automobiles. Mr. Fisher felt he wanted to do his part for his country. He went to President Roosevelt and said, I'll be glad to build a plant. I've got a team of engineers. We've got an approach to come up with a new, bigger, better fighter. And they hired a guy named Don Berlin from the Curtiss Company. And his idea was to do something in a hurry, was to not redesign a whole airplane, is to use parts from other aircraft, use the wings from the P-40. He had a new 24-cylinder engine, which was the biggest engine at that time was being built. Put that in the fuselage, and then have counter-rotating propellers from the nose, and of course this airplane now was fairly good size. Well, it turned out that it had a tail section from the Navy A-24. Well, it didn't take long to find out in flight testing that the longitudinal stability of the airplane just wasn't adequate for really general use at that point in time. So the program only produced about a dozen airplanes. And I think I took 2 of them from the factory to the junkyard. So not everything that people tried obviously works out as they had hoped. But these are the kind of things we would do in flight testing. And we had, the reason I got to fly 147 different airplanes in a short period of time, really, during the last of World War II and up in the early late 40s, is because we had so many aircraft that were designed, and we wanted to be able to be fair and evaluate them if it possibly could be used. So we had this tremendous opportunity to fly all these different airplanes, which doesn't exist today at all. Now you're down to flying, it takes the F-22, it took 20-some years to get out of flight test. And to make a correlation with either the limitation that Don had more opportunity as an operational pilot than some, but my son, who followed somewhat in my footsteps, he went through flight training in 2 different airplanes. He went into SAC to fly bombers. He flew the B-52, the FB-111, and then he was a squadron commander of B-1B bombers. He flew 7 airplanes in 30 years. And that's not abnormal. That's probably normal in today's Air Force. So there's a great deal of difference on what happened during the era that I grew up in the 40s and the opportunity we had. It was a heyday of flying. There's not going to be, probably will never be another day like it, because even aircraft are changing, obviously, as you might expect, drastically. And of course, we've gone beyond aircraft when you think of going on to the moon. And I had a very good close friend that landed on the moon and drove the lunar lander. So anyway, I don't know, I have to talk to Rob on how much time he wants me to continue on here. But no, I think I've mentioned that the reason why our era today is so different than it was when I was growing up in it. And, but along with that, I had, being in flight tests, besides being challenged by flying either a new airplane, we had other opportunities to do things that others didn't have. Now, I was trained as a test pilot in the first course of formal training. And I volunteered and asked my boss to be the pilot to fly the F-86 the Sabre. This became the best fighter during Korea against the MiGs. The F-86 really far outseated the 84 and the P-80. And I was the first Air Force pilot to be able to get to fly that out at Edwards Air Force Base. It was known as Muroc in those days. But it's a beautiful airplane. It had, again, beginning of the jet age, that people don't realize in today's world, we were all underpowered. The P-80, the first jet, P-59, the P-80, and the 84, and the 86, really were underpowered, and they don't realize it added to the, not only the difficulty in using it operationally, but somewhat the safety factor. Because on a hot day, to take off from Colorado at 5,000 feet with an engine that only produced 4,500 pounds of thrust, and the airplane weighs 15,000 pounds, well, you roll every length of the runway before getting off. And I learned the lesson the hard way. I was in 46, I was assigned to take the first P-80s, which was built by Lockheed, the shooting star. Two of us, since I was a major then, I was in charge to take 5 airplanes down to Mexico City, the first to leave the country, and head south out of the country. Well, we rendezvoused in Brownsville, Texas, it is. Brownsville? Anyway, 3 of the fighters came from March Field, which was the first fighter outfit that got jet aircraft operationally. And we went down to Mexico City. Well, we didn't realize, we should have known better, the altitude of Mexico City is over 7,000 feet, and we were going to fly over the inauguration of President Alemán to do a goodwill thing for our country to his country. And lo and behold, on a hot midday, the density altitude really was about 8,400 feet. Well, we really didn't belong on a 7,500-foot runway. And that air, higher altitude, you have less thrust, less performance. So we rolled every foot of the runway before staggering off into the air. And then I really, of course, had realized that we should have known better. We should have even been there. We shouldn't have gone under those conditions. The airplane was not really capable. Today's fighters, in contrast, like the F-15, F-18 that you probably hear around here, they have thrust that measures up 25,000, 30,000 pounds an engine, and with afterburner. So, in the beginning of the jet age, we really did a lot of flying for 5–10 years with underpowered. Even the Boeing 707 commercial airliners, they had to worry about how much of a load how hot the temperature of the day was. The aircraft really didn't have enough extra thrust to be safe. They didn't have the margin they do today. Now the airliner engines have gone from 4 engines to 2 that can develop 80 to 90,000 pounds of thrust. And the jet engine is the most reliable thing that we have in propulsion in today's world. Really, you can feel pretty safe. And once in a while you hear of an incident, but it's pretty rare. The jet engine has turned out to be a wonderful propulsion machine. And I just wish we'd have had more power in the F-86. Now, along with that, the foreign aircraft, I've got the model here of the ME-262, because it's the only jet airplane that became operational in World War II. The Germans built, I think, 1,500 or more of these aircraft. Some of them got operational, and they were about a .82 Mach number aircraft. So they were considerably faster than any of our propeller-driven airplanes. And they had an actual flow, small, they call it a Juno 004 engine. Actually, those engines were not very reliable. They were 15-hour engines. And the reason why they weren't reliable is that it was the infancy of the technology. Metallurgy is the solution to building a good jet engine. And we didn't have the metal knowledge to build the hot gases and the high turbine speeds. And so these early engines, and I remember, well, I taxied out at Wright Field a dozen times at the end of the runway and didn't take off because I wanted to make sure I had enough thrust, and you needed a tailpipe temperature, fuel pressure, and RPM. Lo and behold, the instrumentation wasn't working right. You didn't really know how much thrust you might have, and it really wasn't worth the risk of taking off unless you knew that the engines were performing. So this was the Germans did a great job in producing them. Their technology was somewhat years ahead. Now the British weren't far behind. The British came up with not the actual flow first, but a different compressor, and which made the engine larger. And that's why the first aircraft that we had, the P-80 and the P-59, the P-59 was built by Bell, and it had a centrifugal compressor, which was a copy of the British Neen engine. The British were ahead of us in developing the early jet engine. And we turned it over to General Electric Company, and they produced copies of that British Neen engine. And in the first P-59s, we only built 100 and some of those. And I had the distinction, if you can call it, I was taking a YP model, which was this early service test one, from Wright Field to then would be NASA, it was NACA in those days, down at Langley Field. And unfortunately, the weather became a problem, and I've got the story of the book over here, but I had a land emergency field, and then on takeoff, I lost thrust and went into the trees. The airplane was completely demolished. Fortunately, I was in a situation where the engines were built into the side of the fuselage, and that's where all the strength was. And the cockpit was right ahead of the engines. So I had a lot of protection from the way the airplane was built. And the airplane caught fire, and of course, and kerosene doesn't burn as fast as gasoline. So I stepped out, and they found me wandering around. Literally, I didn't have any other injuries other than a bump on my forehead. So, but I've learned a lot at the beginning of the jet age, and I learned to respect, of course, the limitations of what a jet engine can do and what it can't do. So, along with that, in 1946, the war was over, I was fortunate, and I think it's another lesson that I learned that I hope other people are using it in today's world. It helps to have a mentor. I didn't even know the word what mentor was all about. Do any of you remember really calling back in years ago? You had a good friend that might help you along the way if he knew you. But a mentor is a person who realizes that this young person has some capability, he just needs some encouragement and give him a chance, etc. Well, I had a mentor, and on my charts over here, it says let's see, it's still vertical, I guess, one fell down. My mentor, the best one I ever had, is General Al Boyd. He was a colonel, chief of flight test. The war was over. I'm a reserve officer. We all were, unless you were an academy graduate with a permanent commission. You were there only on the convenience of the government. You could be gone tomorrow. So at the end, when the war was over, he helped myself and maybe 15 or 20 other pilots that he thought ought to stay in the service. He helped us get a permanent commission. Besides that, he got me promoted from a captain to major after the war was over. That's what a mentor is all about. And then he made me chief of fighter test. I had 18 pilots, including Chuck Yeager and Bob Hoover and Pete Everest and Kit Murray and whatever. So here, I was a 24-year-old guy. Came from no place, from high school education, worked my way out, went through the test pilot training, etc. Now, I'm chief of fighter test. Well, I couldn't have been more fortunate. So I feel that I have seen the best of everything. The military couldn't have been better for me. They educated me, they trained me, and gave me good jobs. So, along with that, being at Wright Field, as I mentioned, we got to do all these other things. I got to fly the first jet airmail from Schenectady, New York to Dayton, Ohio. I delivered a personal letter from the CEO of General Electric to Orville Wright, who I landed at Wright-Patterson, and Orville Wright was there in the car to meet me, and I gave him this letter. The first jet airmail cost 5 cents. Later, it cost 8 cents. Anyway, from there, I had another letter to the mayor of Chicago. So I got refueled and went on to Chicago, etc. Well, that was an era, really. Of course, I think they're the best days of my life. The opportunity I had could have been better, and there was there for me to enjoy and try to make the best of it. I was so fortunate in many ways in that being in flight test not only gave me the opportunities that were unusual. I volunteered to go with the Navy. They started the program in 1948, it was a few years after the war was over. So I went through Pensacola, and then after learning to land the SNJ, which one of them here, yeah, SNJ, on the small carrier in the Gulf, we were assigned to Air Group 7 out of Quonset Point, Rhode Island. And I'll tell you, that was a great, we went to flying the last of the Bearcat. The F-8F is known as the Bearcat. They built the Hellcat, the Wildcat, Grumman aircraft, and it was one great fighter with the R-2800 engine. So that was an opportunity that not everybody would have an opportunity to do. Being in the Army Air Corps, of course the Air Force came into being in 1947. And so obviously those of us that were in the Army Air Corps and got a regular commission, when we were automatically then a part of the new Air Force. Well, along with that, let's see, I had the opportunity to go to England on their test facilities at Farnborough and Boston Downs. I went there in 1950 and got to fly 20 of their different aircraft in 45 days. Well, it was really the opportunity for a fighter pilot to get into a Lancaster bomber. It was a wonderful thing, with a 500-foot ceiling too. And of course, they provided the flight engineer, and all I had to do was steer and fly the airplane. The flight engineer took care of the engines and knew everything about the airplane that I didn't really need to know. So those kind of opportunities were just unbelievable. Besides that, another one that was, I guess I was the only one in flight test that ever got to be a technical advisor on a movie at Warner Brothers. 1949, Humphrey Bogart was to be the test pilot, and I went out and spent 3 or 4 months advising Bogart, well, more the producer and director than Bogart. He was the actor. I don't think he even really particularly cared about being a test pilot myself, but we made a movie that was still had to use models, of course, to simulate the flight of an airplane, which we never developed the power plant. It was a revolutionary propulsion system to take off and fly at 90,000 feet over the North Pole and land in Washington. I mean, the scenario was a little wild, and I got kidded from my peers to no end about how accurate it was, but I tried to keep everything within bounds of what was technically possible, and I had a great time working with Humphrey Bogart and Raymond Massey and Richard Warp and Eleanor Parker. She was a young starlet then. She was a brand new gal, and anyway, it was an experience, of course, that you just can't compare. You don't know what anything is like until you get in that location. And being inside the studio and seeing how a movie is put together in 45 days is really a wonderful opportunity. So these are the kind of things that being at Wright Field and flight test, a lot of our flying, of course, was done out at Muroc, which became Edwards Air Force Base. And when you mention the name Edwards Air Force Base, that brings back very close memories to me, because Glenn Edwards was my best friend at that time. He and I shared quarters. He was a bachelor, the same as I was, and so he got killed in the YB-49. I had to take care of all his personal effects, of course, with his family. So I did that for not only Glenn Edwards, I also lost several other close friends at Wright Field. That's one of the things you just have to accept doing, because there are going to be a few losses at times. So anyway, from going from flight test, obviously it was going to be a new world. And after being gone from World War II days, the personnel people decided I ought to go to Korea. And they gave me an assignment first to be the operations officer in F-84s flying out of Daegu, Korea. Somehow or other, because again, mentors, somebody, the man that was vice commander, a major general in the headquarters of Far East Air Force, heard that I was coming over, and I had flown the 86, and the 86 was going to be the key airplane to fight the MiGs. So they changed my orders to have me come to the headquarters Far East Air Force in Tokyo. And I traveled with the commander to every fighter base that he ever went to. And, but they used my experience in other ways. I wasn't flying anymore, but I was behind the desk. But I was trying to use my knowledge to make the fighter force the best force against North Korea and the Soviets who were flying the MiGs. So that was an assignment that took me out of the realm of flying. And when I came back to the U.S. in 1954, back to the Washington, and like a lot of people, they don't volunteer to go to the Pentagon. But the Pentagon actually turned out to be not too bad for me. Actually, I was a fighter development officer in the air staff. And my projects were the F-100 C&D built by North American, and the F-105 built by Republic Aircraft, which would be a Mach 2 airplane that had an engine that now had considerably more thrust than the earlier ones. So I felt I had a good job and a good responsibility, and I could influence the change of some of the things that had to be considered for these new aircraft that were going to be developed. So it turned out that my being in the Pentagon led to, when you normally serve 4 years in a Pentagon tour. And my boss says, "Where do you want to go, Ken?" And I said, "I want to be the program manager on the newest fighter in development." And in a matter of minutes, he picked up the phone, and people can do that in the right location. I was the new program manager of the F-108, a long-range interceptor that was to cruise at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, above 70,000 feet, with a missile bay with atomic warhead missiles in this long-range interceptor. And with a brand new fire control system built by Hughes, it was going to be the best thing against the Soviets. Because then the Soviets, now instead of being allies, they were our Cold War enemy. And so the long-range interceptor was going to be the thing that we needed the most. Well, as sometimes happens, the Air Force and all the other services, it happens the same thing. They get over-programmed, get more things they'd like to have, but they don't have the money to support it all. So it was a question of the technology in building the 108, which is to fly it 3 times. It was competing with the B-70. The B-70 was built by North American. They were sister airplanes, the bomber and the fighter, but they had the same technology, same engines, etc. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me to work on the latest development of a new fighter. And even though when the program got canceled, it led to something else that was interesting for my career, and that is we needed to flight test the fire control system in a test bed. We wanted to fly in an airplane that would somewhat be comparable to the 108 expected performance. So you may have heard of course, you all know of the U-2 airplane that Kelly Johnson was the engineer at Lockheed that ran the Skunk Works. And what happened there is the U-2 had come to the end of its somewhat useful life, although it's still flying today. Anyway, he designed the SR-71, the Blackbird, which has got the world speed record yet today, over 2,100 miles per hour. It cruises at 3 times the speed of sound. Well, I said that's the airplane we need as a test bed for continuing the fire control and missile system that was eventually used by the Navy in the F-14. So anyway, what happened is I had the job and working with the CIA is not the normal channel, which I had never been in before. They call it the black programs, and we got money that was all channeled through the CIA works. And so I had to get $90 million to build 3 test aircraft to test the fire control and missile system. And of course, all this is now very secret, and not being in the normal channels for approval, I had to I put together a briefing out in the Skunk Works where Kelly Johnson, who I think was the country's one of the greatest test engineers that designed aircraft, no question he was on the forefront of most of our new programs. Anyway, they let me go ahead and brief 5 people to get $90 million, and it was a wonderful experience because when the people you talk to are at the very highest level, and all they have to do is say thumbs up or thumbs down. You don't have all this other malarkey about waiting months to hear from a decision maker. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Well, I'll never forget, I briefed the Chief of the Air Force, General Thomas D. White, who was the 4th Chief, and a 50-minute briefing, one-on-one, nobody else in the room. He was not a technical person per se, so they told me, you know, kind of take the edges off of it, and it was interesting to be able to talk to these people at those levels and get their approval. And I did get approval from all 5, so I got the $90 million, and they built 3 YF-12s. The F-12 it was a sister airplane to the SR-71, the Blackbird. So these kind of opportunities all grew out of my being involved in flight tests. And that's why I say that I couldn't have been a more fortunate individual than when I, through my combat missions, to come back and be able to fly at Wright Field and then out at Edwards, and to be able to fly the first flights on the 86, obviously that's a test pilot's dream come true. So I hope I've added a little bit to your knowledge and put it in perspective of aviation within this last period of time. All of my flying, I think back, all occurred during the 40s, mind you. 10 years. 40s and World War II and the beginning of the jet age. So I think you can agree with me that I've had nothing but a wonderful flying career. I owe it to this country. I really feel that we just don't know how lucky we are to live in this country and be citizens of this country and have the support. We want to give our country the best we have in every way. So, hope you enjoyed it. I have a book that tells the story. There's not another book published like it. And we do have this, the money for $20 goes to a good cause, an educational fund of children that work at Wright Field, military or civilian. It has 80 different airplanes, 72 authors. I have 3 stories in here out of those, 130 stories. So it's a unique book. It's only being sold now at Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum, the National Museum. If you want one of these, it's available for $20. And I guess they have these. Those of you that want to have one of these autographed, I'd be glad to do so. So I'm glad to have been here, and wish you all well.
Ladies and gentlemen, truly a historic figure. One bit of personal information in my Navy career, 6 airplanes, 147 incredible airplanes. Please don't touch the models. They belong to the colonel. They have sentimental value. And as usual, I have the mic ready for anybody who'd like to ask the colonel questions. Just raise your hand.
Colonel, I have a question. You certainly have your experience in dealing with experimental aircraft at Wright-Patterson and perhaps some other areas of the country. My question is, what is the most exotic and unique aircraft you've ever encountered?
He's got it.
Well, let me add it several ways. My favorite aircraft, I always get asked, what's your favorite aircraft in World War II? And it's the P-51D model. But in my den, I have 3 airplanes that I have showing up. And that is, in my view, the best fighter airplanes developed during World War II. The P-51, the Spitfire by the British. I flew 3 models of it, the Spitfire, the 7, and the 12. And then the German Focke-Wulf 190 is one of my favorite airplanes. So that I considered were sort of the epitome of the best fighters of the World War II era. Now, as far as the thing that meant the most to me looking to flying was the F-86. To fly, I flew 11 flights in 5 days. And the purpose of flying Phase 2 flight test is to do nothing more than to confirm what the contractor is telling us. The contractor is obviously his pilot and et cetera. The people are prejudiced in telling us the best features of the airplane, not necessarily some of the other aspects. So getting to fly 11 flights in 5 days in that F-86, to me was the best experience that I could have ever hoped for, and I think that I accomplished. And to me, that was that. Now, I've had a few other hair-raising experiences, but that's something else.
Someone else?
No, I know Colonel James Doolittle had a similar career in flying experimental aircraft. How did your career and his career align?
I guess I didn't quite understand the question.
How did you overlap with Colonel Doolittle's or the time frame? It's going to be very similar because of your time in World War II.
Well, Jimmy Doolittle, of course, was ahead of my time. He was almost one generation ahead. General Jimmy Doolittle had a wonderful flying career up before World War II. When the World War II started, as I remember, he was a lieutenant colonel in the reserves. And he was well recognized by all of his cohorts because of his experience. General Doolittle was probably in the U.S. was one of the best aviators that our country had that understood aviation at that time. And that's why General Arnold, who knew him personally, asked him to evaluate, like the example of the B-26 that became, sort of famous as a Widowmaker. One a day in Tampa Bay, all sorts of things were refuted on the B-26. But General Doolittle flew it and fed it one engine. He did things that other people wouldn't think of doing purposely, and he proved that the airplane, and they made some changes. They added some more wing and the length of the wingspan, and they changed, I think, the propeller, and et cetera. So they did things to improve the airplane, and the B-26 became a good medium-altitude bomber for World War II. So General, besides, he's, of course, most famous for taking the responsibility for getting the first airstrike against Japan and launching the 16 B-25s off of the carrier was really a great undertaking. It's too bad that they had to take off when they did because that shortened their range, and they needed more fuel to get to escape back over to the mainland of China. And where some of them didn't make it, some of them became prisoners of war in Japan's prison. And of course, they're down now to, I don't know, how many are left on the crews?
I think they lost 4 out of 16.
I think the number of pilots are left.
How many are still left?
Yeah.
5.
5 only of the crew that flew on the 16 airplanes that made that first airstrike against Japan. They have reunions every year, and the last one living gets to get the bottle of
Takes a
cognac.
while way home, yeah.
Anyway, they're a legend in aviation history, and it's wonderful. Obviously, it was marginal. What they were trying to do in that day and age was extremely marginal of being successful. And they took off a little sooner than they had planned, which shortened their range of the aircraft.
Two of the survivors were here in May, when you had the air show here in May. The co-pilot for Doolittle and his navigator were both here.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? And as I'm walking the microphone back here, in about 5 minutes, the Mustang will start up, and the flight demo will be shortly after that.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. And given the fact that Messerschmitt 262 is really a prototype, how did you rate its flying performance?
How did you rate its flying capabilities?
The flying capabilities of the 262, Messerschmitt.
What do you think of the capabilities of the airplane?
The German Messerschmitt 262.
Oh yeah. The 262 was a little faster than any of the jets that we had even many years later. And we rated it about a 0.84 Mach number airplane. And speed-wise, now we had a German who, at the end of the war, thought he dove the airplane full power, and he went through the speed of sound. And I've been involved in putting the story to rest, I hope, that he couldn't possibly have gone through the sonic barrier. It's really not a sound, it's not, the speed of sound, of course, is something that has been often misused a bit as far as talking about as barrier. And it's just a transition period more than it was a barrier. But the German pilot that flew it was operational, and I met him. In fact, I invited him to come down where I lived in Florida, and I introduced him to Slick Cooper, the Bell test pilot on the X-1. And so we tried to get him to understand that aerodynamically the airplane really wasn't properly capable of flying faster than the speed of sound. And what he experienced, he talked about the airplane shaking and there was flutter and that sort of thing. That was to be expected because of his aerodynamic limitations at the time, but the airplane really wasn't. And I've got some of the best reports that are available to disprove the fact that he couldn't have gone faster than the speed of sound. So other than that, though, right now they're building 5 of these aircraft out in the West Coast. They'll be built for air shows, and they'll be built with not engines like June had a little 4, they'll have a little General Electric J85 engine, and it'll be a wonderful airplane for air shows. I really think this will be I hope they complete it. They're undergoing some flight testing now, I guess. But it costs a lot of money for people to do this on their own, as you can imagine.